Yes. Blue. Good morning. Good to see you here today. I trust that we are all fed up from Thanksgiving. I hope, as far as food goes. Hopefully nothing else. But it's good to be back here together here this morning. This time we have special music. Very good. Thank you. We are going to go back to Numbers chapter 15 here this morning. Numbers chapter 15 as we kind of pick up where we left off 2 weeks ago. Because last week we were focused on Thanksgiving. And so we want to go back to Numbers chapter 15. Really going to be at the end of the chapter because the beginning is all about the addition of several laws they'll have being added to them by God here in Numbers 15. We want to look at and I don't know if this makes sense to you as you read this, but it makes sense to me as I make application to this passage. How do we respond to our chaos, whatever it might be? We need to know to remember. Sometimes I think it's easy to forget in what we are to be remembering. As we went to the wilds here this last weekend, this last several days, it was not hard for me to remember what those trails were like. For some reason, I did not forget that. I guess a quick story. If you know about the wilds, they have 4 big waterfalls on this, I guess, river that runs through their property on their 1,000 acres. And if the river was in a straight line, which it isn't, but from camp, if camp was here, you'd have Falls 1, Falls 2, Falls 3, Falls 4. I guess if I could work on a vertical plane here. And so from the camp, which we could say is right here, the trail kind of goes up around here and back around, and then there's a little trail that goes over to 1. But the main trail will continue on, and then there's a little trail that winds on down, I think with a bunch of steps that goes to number 2. And then the trail gets even farther from the river, but there's another trail with, was it like 60 steps? They go down to an overlook for Falls 3. And then, I kid you not, to get to the Falls 4, the trail is now like way up beyond, and then it circles, I think, past it, curves around and comes back to it. And so that would be the normal route. And then once you're there, there's a kind of like a water runway, what do you call that, through the mountain? So it's not a trail, it's more of what the water has made. And so because it's basically formed by water, it is just a sheer rock. And sometimes there's tree roots that kind of go across it. But for the most part, it's about literally like at about that incline, pretty much just rock. Well, when you made your way all the way to the Falls 4, to get back to the trail, to get to 3, 2, and 1, or to get back to camp, you can either go back all the way around, which is rather redundant, or you can go straight up. And for a section, I bet it's like 50, 60 feet, it's literally a rope that you have to pull yourself up because the incline is so much. Well, anyway, that last hurricane they had wiped out the trail. So this whole route, which honestly is absolutely exhausting to go this way. But that was completely destroyed. Trees fall down. I think it washed out part of it, and so that part of the trail is closed. Now the only way to get to Falls 4 is straight down. You get there, and then it's straight up. So Matt took us there to the falls. And keep in mind, it rained all day Tuesday. We knew that the trails were going to be wet on Thanksgiving Day, so we avoided the trails on Thursday. Friday morning, we went to do the trails, and it was still wet. I mean, it's all covered by trees. So this incline, literally at this amount, sometimes it's more like this amount, is covered in leaves, wet leaves. And so we're going down, and if you're walking uphill, your gravity and momentum is pulling you down, so you have to fight forward. And so, if you get in, say this is the next step, and it's literally like that. Every step is like this. You can kind of make sure your foot is sure, and then you transfer your weight up. Well, when you're going down, once you've gotten past your midpoint, your weight is already transitioning. So after several attempts of Jen and I, which the kids had already gone well ahead of us, because you take a step and then you're sliding. For the kids, they don't mind falling back and just even riding on their backside, just boom, 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 boom down a little bit, so they catch their foot again. And that's not so cool for us. I think we're getting too old for that, especially when this is rock. So partway down, you got this rock sticking straight out, and so those aren't things that we're not thinking this is going to be farewell for us. And it's just a constant. I mean, every muscle in your body is tense because you take a step and you don't know when that step is going to end. You could slide 30 feet, you could slide 2 inches. You don't know. And several times I would take a step and start to slide, and I'd grab what I assume is a tree to hold on to, because again, this is just a water path. It's literally this wide. And then there's trees on either side of this little trail. you grab a tree, but it winds up being just a branch that got knocked down in the hurricane, and so it goes with you down the. And I'm in the back, my wife's right in front of me, and at one point, finally, my wife just stops and says, "I don't think we should do this." And honestly, I said, "That is such an answer to prayer. I am so ready to stop because I'm going to die. We are both going to die doing this." And Matt is a strong guy. He works out continuously, plus his job is continuous manual labor. I had no doubt that Matt could get his way out of there, even with one of his siblings on his back or on his shoulders. I have no doubt on that. The likelihood of them doing that with me is pretty much not going to happen. Now, once we got to the main trail, I have no doubt that he could even carry me when we're on the, just a normal this, but not this way. That's not going to happen. So we bailed on that, and we had to go on what we remembered of the Falls 4 and wait for the kids to meet us back up.
We saw Falls 3.
We went to 3, which they didn't get to see, and just enjoyed. Now 3, literally, when you get back to the top, back to the main trail, 3 is literally maybe 30 yards down the trail and about 60 steps down, and there's Falls number 3. And so we walked down there and sat there for quite some time and enjoyed the beauty with no children, just thinking to ourselves, I hope they are still alive. And kind of texting Matt once in a while saying, we hope you're watching those kids. Keep them safe. But anyway, there's a lot of things that in our lives that we choose to not remember. Sometimes for our good, sometimes for our bad, when we choose to not remember. Ironically, I cannot remember if I've ever shared this illustration before. It does seem familiar. I know I've read it before. I just can't remember if I've shared it. Until 1973, when this man died, an elderly man would be seen every Friday night walking slowly down a Florida dock with a bucket full of shrimp. And by the time he'd make his way to the end of that dock, he'd be surrounded by seagulls, and then he'd proceed to feed the seagulls from his bucket of shrimp. This elderly man obviously was not always an elderly man, and much earlier in 1942, he was a B-17 pilot. He was part of a flying fortress on its way to New Guinea to meet up with General Douglas MacArthur. And somewhere on their flight path, they got lost. And with fuel tanks empty and no land at all in sight, they had to ditch the plane and spent a month drifting in the ocean. Certainly by this month time frame, their supplies had been well used up, and that which wasn't used up was destroyed by the salt of the sea. And so on this particular day, with great starvation and certain death on the horizon, one of them led a group in a short service. They sang and they prayed. And then as the heat of the day began to strike heavy on them, they all put their hats down and ultimately waited to die. And it was on this particular day that Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, who would be later this elderly man making his way down the dock, Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, with his hat down over his eyes, felt something land on his head. Perhaps hundreds of miles from any shore, something lands on his head, and he knew without even moving that had the sensation of a seagull. And as he peered from underneath the brim of his hat, he could see that the other guys also were aware that there was something on his head that could mean sustenance, that could mean we could live beyond today, if you can catch it. So in one quick movement, he caught the seagull, and they were able to eat it. Now, the whole thought of that, just raw and all that sounds rather harsh, but I guess you do what you have to do. And then they were able to use some of its insides, obviously, that they didn't eat, as bait and caught fish. They were able to survive until they were found. Well, this now elderly man, Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, every Friday night took a bucket full of shrimp to feed the seagulls because he didn't want to forget what had happened. Now, we know that wasn't the seagull that spared them. It was God who sent the seagull that spared them. Very much like Noah, not very much because he didn't eat the animal, but very much like Noah and like the children of Israel in the middle of nowhere, the manna was provided in the form of a bird. And certainly out far from the shores, here comes a bird landing and was able to provide what was necessary for this entire group of men to live even 31 years later, still remembering. Well, as we remember from last time, 2 weeks ago, as we recall, the nation of Israel rebelled against Moses and God. They wanted to turn back to Egypt. Moses pleads with them. Moses pleads with God. They are spared. They are judged. And then out of their somewhat confession, but yet still rebellious hearts, they decide that they're going to do what has now been condemned of them. You cannot enter the promised land, for you will now wander for 40 years. Well, they have a night of mourning, a night of somewhat repenting, and in their hearts they conclude that all is well, let's do what we want now. Let's go to the promised land. Obviously, the natives of the land have other opinions. God did not go with them. Moses did not go with them. Aaron did not go with them. The Ark of the Covenant did not go with them. And they were chased back into the desert. And so begins the 40 years of wandering. Numbers chapter 15 begins the essence of several more laws. And we wanted to pick up in verse 30. And it begins, I'm going to kind of pick up in the middle of a thought, but for the sake of time, I want to hopefully catch you up on this. It says, but the soul that doeth ought presumptuously, whether he be born in the land or a stranger, the same reproacheth the Lord, and that soul shall be cut off from among his people. Because he hath despised the word of the Lord, and hath broken his commandment, that soul shall utterly be cut off, his iniquity shall be upon him. Basically what has been happening in the last several verses, God is giving commands and then punishments in breaking of those commands. And it seems as we get towards verse 30, that God is making it clear that there's a difference between, can we say, innocent disobedience and presumptuous disobedience. In other words, there are going to be times that the children of Israel would forget what God had said, and in their forgetfulness, in their ignorance even, they would commit a sin unknowingly. Or maybe be one of those as a child. You know, how often did perhaps your parents say, didn't you know better? Well, yeah. Just in the moment, I forgot. I wasn't thinking, just doing what I wanted, yes, I knew. God makes it very clear that there seems to be a difference in punishment as he lays out for those that are sinning in innocence versus those who are sinning presumptuously. Now, what I find very interesting about this idea of presumptuously, it has that idea of a very public display of rebellion, as in other words, watch me while I sin, kind of a mentality. It's amazing to me how even on network, I shouldn't say even on network television, but on network television, because it's not surprising that it's on network television, how sin is presumptuous sin, if we could use that same Old Testament word, is promoted, as it says in Romans, not only promoted, but almost glorified today. Those who should know that this is wrong, living it out in such a way that it's almost as if those standing by kind of applaud them for their courage, so to speak. It's rebellion. It's obvious, contrary to what God has called them to do, but in their presumptuousness, in their, I know that this is wrong, but I'm going to do it anyway, and I'm going to rejoice in the fact that I'm doing it anyway, and I'm hoping that you will rejoice in it as well. Calling good evil and evil good, and rejoicing in the same. Is ultimately what we see lived out before us here today. That presumptuous sin. It continues on because this very next word, or not next word, but in this very next verse, we have a word that kind of is a catchword for presumptuous sin. It says in verse 32, and while the children of Israel were in the wilderness, they, and at least in the King James, it says found. I don't know what other versions say. Found. They found a man that gathered sticks upon the Sabbath day. Now, the Lord had already laid down some guidelines in regards to the Sabbath day. And it says, and while the children of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man that gathered sticks upon the Sabbath day. That word found is not like a seek and find kind of a found. It is not I lost my keys and now I found them. It is more of an emboldened, they couldn't help but see him kind of a word in the Hebrew. I remember growing up, and perhaps you do as well, if you were so inclined to watch Cubs games. This was before they had night games, before they had lights, and they would have those day games, and I suppose they still did that even after the lights, but in my thinking, in my story, let it be day games with no lights. Back when Wrigley Field was Wrigley Field. And you'd have a rain delay, and you recall as the grounds crew would lay that tarp out across the infield, what would often happen with the players from the dugout? Probably not every rain delay, but probably the very long rain delays. It just keeps going on, and it's just raining. And the broadcasters up in the booth are running out of things to say because it's been an hour rain delay, and the game's not yet called. But we wait. And out from the dugout comes at least one player in full uniform, runs out across that tarp and just does a full slide. And the water just flies up. And before long, here comes another one. And then perhaps another one. Now, every person that put their foot on that tarp undoubtedly got fined a lot of money. Probably more money than I make in a couple of years. But to them, it was really just the money that they made since the game was delayed. In the last hour, this is what they made, and they got fined that amount. But it was always kind of a fun thing to wait out the rain delays in hopes that, as a child, some grown multimillionaire adult male would do what every child has always wanted to do. Now, as I would watch that game and that rain delay and hear them going on, but every once in a while they'd show a picture of the tarp with the rain bouncing off of it, you long to see just one player gutsy enough to run out of that dugout and do what all of us boys thought was really important to do. That's kind of the idea here of the word found. There wasn't any hiding involved. The guy running out of the dugout is not doing it in secret. He's doing it before the audience that is still there, before the broadcast, before the television cameras, before his coach, before the owner of the team. They all see it. But he's running out there, and to all of the watching world, he was found to be sliding across that tarp. That's the word. That's the concept that is used here. They found a man gathering sticks on the Sabbath. In verse 33 it says, and they found him and gathering sticks, brought him unto Moses and Aaron, and unto all the congregation, and they put him inward, because it was not declared what should be done to him. Now we know that God has just declared, if this is a presumptuous sin, the punishment is death. If God says, this is what you should do, and you refuse to do it, and you do it boldly, there's only one punishment. It's death. Well, let me back up. The punishment was to be put out of the camp, to be no longer a part of them. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean death? And if it means death, what kind of death? Or does it mean literally that you are no longer a part of us, you're on your wilderness on your own, to figure it out on your own, which ultimately would also result in certain death when you're out there by yourself. But either way, God didn't give the specifics of how. He said he put off, whatever word you want to use. He was not to be included to be as part of them. But what does that mean? And so they go back to Moses. They bring this man, they put him in a kind of a makeshift jail, and they go to Moses and say, all right, now we need the details. What is it that we need to do? Verse 34 again, and they put him in an inward, because it was not declared what should be done to him. The Lord said unto Moses, that man shall surely be put to death, and all the congregation shall stone him with stones without the camp. Verse 36, and all the congregation brought him without the camp, and stoned him with stones, and he died as the Lord commanded Moses. What a sad obituary. An entire life is defined simply by this. And they stoned him with stones, and he died. The family goldfish perhaps gets more recognition and more emotion than what was involved with this man's life, as it's recorded for us. But God's making it very clear, when I've commanded you to do something and you blatantly disobey me, here is the consequence. Now, let me back up again. I've said this many times, but I need to say it again. We are not the nation of Israel. The church is not the nation of Israel. The church is been grafted in, but you can see in Revelation there's two future histories, if we could use that combination of words. Future histories, because in Revelation we're looking at it from the future looking backwards, but for us we're looking at it from our point looking forwards. So it's our future history is what I'll call it. We have a future history of Israel, and we have a future history of the church. And while they at times have similarities, they are very different. And so the church is not Israel, nor are we at this point in numbers on this side of the cross as we are today. But yet I think it's a very interesting insight into the holiness of our God, who says, I command you, you disobey blatantly, the penalty is death. And here's this man who is picking up sticks on the Sabbath. We don't know why. We don't know what the reasoning is. Was it to make a fire? Was it to clean up his yard, so to speak? We don't know the details. But he was picking up sticks. And the punishment of his blatant disobedience was death, and all that's recorded for us. And the people stoned him with stones, and he died, as the Lord had commanded them. What a living and / dying testimony that nation had because of one man picking up sticks. But God goes one step farther and wants them to remember. He wants them to do some things in their life that will cause them to remember. And I think I have some quick points. I know it's already getting late, but the cue to remember. Look at verse 38. Oh, let me back up to verse 37. It's important. It says, And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, verse 38, Speak unto the children of Israel, and bid them that they make them fringes on the borders of their garments throughout their generation, that they put upon the fringe of the borders a riband of blue. And it shall be unto you for a fringe, that ye may look upon it, and remember all the commandments of the Lord, and do them. And that ye shall not seek after your own heart and your own eyes, after which ye used to go a-whoring. I'll try to look at Caitlin's hat. Her hat right now just got the little poof on the top. But we probably have all seen those hats. And many times it's young children or girls will have that, where it has the thing on the side. You know, it's got the strand, and I don't know if you use it to tie it under or what the deal with it. It just has these little strands going down. Well, ultimately, what they were being told to do was on the corners of their garments. And remember, their garments weren't like ours. They didn't have sleeves and pant legs and all that like we wear today. If I could be in the crudest form, basically they wore bed sheets, if we could say it in that regard. And so you would have four corners of this robe that you put around them. On every one of those corners, they were to continue the sewing. I'm not a person who makes things that way. But as they would sew in, like continue, kind of like those hats, you know what I'm trying to say? They continue on sewing this thing down so that it would be like this fringe hanging down from each of the corners, a continuation of the making of the fabric. And woven into this thing hanging down, they're to put a blue thread through it and kind of weave it through so that you'd have this kind of like, again, picture the hat on the four corners of their garments with this blue ribbon woven through it. And so you kind of get an idea. Now, certainly God is not giving them fashion cues on how to be dressing fancy when they go to the mall, because they're going to be wandering for 40 years. God is giving them a change in their clothing to be a constant reminder to them that blue, not only the fringe, but the blue thread through it, be a constant reminder to them that what the Lord God has commanded us, we not only need to remember, we need to do. Now, I'm not saying that you have to do that. You know, my wife, I'm not going to go home and ask my wife to sew in little things hanging off the edge of my coats and my pants and all of that. I'm not saying that we need to do that. We aren't Israelites, and we are the other side of the cross from them at this point. But it is important to realize that God says this is important, that you need to remember this, and you need to make whatever changes is necessary so that you do remember this. To go to, and I can't believe I'm even referring to a Christmas movie, probably because my daughter already announced this morning at breakfast, you know what we're going to do this afternoon? We're watching a Christmas movie. Thanks, Kate. Guess I'll be doing homework this afternoon. But you remember I just lost it. It's a Wonderful Life. It's a Wonderful Life. I forget the uncle's name. There in the bank. Remember when George comes back to the bank and the uncle still got the... And if I'm recalling watching the movie correctly, George Bailey says, I just married, and basically says, you can untie that ribbon now. We're done. And he says something, the uncle says something, oh, George, I wanted to be there, or something along those lines. And now that I completely slaughter that whole, that's probably what we'll wind up watching here this afternoon, if nothing else. But you know, there are times that we have to have that sewed-on little ribbon on our finger. There are times that, as they had to have the little dangly things hanging off their robes with the blue ribbon woven through it, so they'd be reminded to remember. And not just to remember, but to do. It is important to remember. For them, it was very important. You forget, you're going to get punished. Even if it's innocence, you forget, you will be punished. If you know and you still refuse to do, you will be killed. It will be your death. So you've got to remember, but you've also got to do. It specifically says in those verses, remember and do. Now, some interesting connection here, and I have the references listed out there. 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 20. Remember when David is hunted, and he finds Saul. Remember what he does to Saul when he finds Saul in the cave? Remember what he does? It says that he cuts the hem of his garment. Now, he's not talking about he's talking about the dangly things that Saul would have had to be wearing to remind him of the obedience of God. David went in and cut that off. And Saul's instant response was, and I'll read this to you, and now behold, I know well that thou shalt surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in thy hand. Not only because his life was spared, but because David did something drastic. Basically removed Saul from the anointed path of God. Ultimately is how that, I guess in layman's terms, would be the result there. In the New Testament, Luke chapter 8, in fact it's Matthew 9:20, Mark 5:27, and Luke chapter 8, verses 43 to 44. Let me read Luke's account. It says, and a woman having an issue of blood 12 years, which had spent all her living upon physicians, neither could be healed of any, came behind him and touched what? Same spot. It's the same thing. Again, it's not just talking about the hem. It's talking about this. She's literally reaching for what Christ would have been wearing as a Jew, a little dangly thread with a blue weave in it that was to be a constant reminder of all that God had commanded and done. That is what she's reaching for. As really a symbol of, we are God's and you are Him. And so she reaches for that. And obviously we know the rest of the story, and she's healed. Matthew chapter 14, verses 35 and 36. And when the men of that place had knowledge of him, they sent out into all that country round about, and brought unto him all that were diseased, and besought him that they might only touch the hem of his garment. Again, that part. And as many as touched were made perfectly whole. Mark chapter 6, verse 46. And whatsoever he entered into villages or cities or country that laid the sick in the street, besought him that they might touch as it were but the border of his garment. Again, the constant reminder to not only remember, but to do. It was obviously of great importance from this point, Numbers 15, even on to the time of Christ. In fact, remember, as Christ is rebuking the Pharisees, he says this in Matthew 23, verse 5. But all their works they do for to be seen of men. They make broad their phylacteries. God never commanded them to have phylacteries, but they made them broad. And enlarge the borders of their garments. In fact, this is how this worked. If everybody else's little, hat dangly thing on their garments was 3 inches long, they made theirs 6 inches long. As if we are really going to remember, because our dangly woven blue thing is longer than yours. And Christ is rebuking them. Hey, this is whoa. This is not what this is about. This is not about who has the longer. This is not that's not what the point is. What was the point? Back to Numbers chapter 15. The point is that you might remember and that you might do. Rebuking them because they remembered, but they refused to do. So here's the cue to remember. First part or the last part, I should say, of verse 39. I already read it, but let me read it again. And that you seek not after your own heart and your own eyes, after which you used to go a-whoring. A danger to remember. That word seek. That you seek not after your own heart and your own eyes is both an active and passive concept of spying and following. Ironically, it would be a word in the Greek, in the Hebrew, I guess it could be the Greek, it was the Septuagint, In the Hebrew, it would have been a word, in fact, it's tor. The Hebrew word has that idea that would be used to describe the spies as they went. As they went to spy out the land, that was the word that was used. But here it's not only that concept, but as well that idea of following after. In other words, we are going to spy it out and follow after what we have spied upon. As the 10, again, 12 men went to spy on Canaan, and read, 2 were good. Those 10 men, they went a-spying and they went a-whoring on after what they found. In their minds, this is bad, and their hearts followed rapidly thereafter. Christ says here at the end of verse 39 that you don't do that. You go spying out, interpreting without God in the equation, and allow your heart to go after that which is obviously void of God. That you seek not after your own heart and your own eyes, after which you used to go a-whoring, as these 10 men that have just died in your presence did before you. As this one man who went picking up sticks died before you. Have these things sewn onto the bottom so that you might remember, because there's a danger. If you allow yourselves to go after what your eyes see, what your eyes want, it will lead you to danger. And I think, while this is still Old Testament, I think there's a great application for us today. When we leave our spying/following void of God, our path will often, if not always, lead us to danger. When my path is void of God, my path is a dangerous path. Literally what is being said in verse 39. Don't go living life like those spies did. They went interpreting with their eyes and let their hearts and their minds follow after their own interpretation that was void of God. Don't go a-whoring with your eyes. Don't go a-whoring after that which you can only see. As a child, how many of us, you don't need to raise your hand because it's probably all of us, how many of us had monsters in our rooms that ultimately was the reflection of the moon being halted by a branch that is now being moved in the wind? And suddenly in the confines of our bedroom late at night, all we see is this moving shadow of a monster. It's not a monster. It's a branch from a tree that's always been there. And every time the wind blows, that branch goes like this. But because now it's nighttime and there's a big moon out and the moon is casting its light or reflection of the light into the room, and that branch is in the way of that reflection of that light, you now have a shadow cast on your wall. But in our interpretation, we now are envisioning something that is bad. And how many of us, again, don't raise your hand, but how many of us had some sleepless nights with our hearts racing because of the shadows on the wall of our room? Don't run after that which your eyes see that is void of God, because it will lead you into paths of danger. As a parent, how many times have you been called, perhaps as a parent, called into a room of a child who is scared to death of said shadows on the wall, and what often, I hope, would be our response? Number one, to show them that it's just a branch outside the window. But number two, to remind them, God is still here with you. Because when we begin to live out life void of our God, we will always run to danger. Our minds will always interpret bad things, and our hearts will always follow thereafter. And so there's a danger in remembering. There's a danger to remember. There's a danger that we need to be aware of if we refuse to remember. Remember this. Use those 10 guys who died of the plague right before your eyes. Use their death as a reminder to you. You live out, you go a-whoring after that which your eyes see without interpreting in the light of God. There's going to be danger. And undoubtedly there's going to be death if you do so. Again, church is not Israel. We are on the other side of the cross. And I know that brings some confusion to the message. But what a reminder of our God. What a reminder of the importance to remember. But then let's continue on verses 40 and 41. That you may remember and do all my commandments and be holy unto your God. I am the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord your God. Here's the reason to remember. Why the tassels? Why the blue thread? Why the remembrance? Why the pointing back to these guys who are now dead and their corpse has been buried? Why the reminder of this man who had just died because he was picking up sticks on the Sabbath and blatantly disobeyed God? Why the remembering of what God has said, and not just the remembering, but the doing of what God has just said? Why is that? And a lot of times, in fact, we were discussing college. Some on our week, in fact, Matt was giving the girls some grief as they were wearing their Bruin shirts, and Matt was wearing his, in fact, I have a little side note, I know I'm going to go a little late here. A little side note, as the kids made their way back up from the Fourth Falls, having, number one, gone down this path, now visited the falls, got some pictures, of which we weren't able to do, and then made their way back up. Matt and Josiah came up first. And we could hear the girls talking, or maybe it was them gasping for breath as they made their way up. So we knew that they were behind at some point, and we knew that they were still alive, following behind. But Matt, obviously he's been doing this now for 2.5 years. And so this is just a walk he's taking. For the rest of us, me included, myself specifically included, this is the walk of death for me. So Matt's just another day. Matt comes up and I was like, hey, did you leave your sisters behind? What's up with your sisters? He points to his sweatshirt. That's what Maranatha can do. They're wearing Bruin stuff. We know the truth is this is what's the point of the tassels? What's the point of the remembering? What's the point of the blue weave? Obviously, it's going to make them stick out. Everybody, every land, every people group is going to know. Everybody that got the blue weave on those little tassels hanging off the corners of their garments, well, they're part of a group. They're part of the nation of Israel. That's who they are. It's a signification of whose they are. But God says, here's the reason why you do this. Because I am the Lord your God. It was me that brought you out. I am the Lord your God. And so often we begin to live out life, and I guess my point in talking about colleges was this. So often in college with the rules and all that takes place, we begin to lose sight of why do we have to obey? Why do we have to follow this rule? Why do we have to follow that rule? Why do we have to do this? Why can't we do that? And it is a good college that says, here's why. It's because of God. It's because God is your God. And that's exactly what God is saying here in verse 41. This is why. This is why, because I am your Lord. I am your God. It was me who brought you here, and I am your God. Remember, not because of you, not for your sake. This is not about you. This is not about your clothing. This is not about living in fear of the dangers. This is not about wandering for 40 years. This is about me. Don't forget, this is about me. Now again, I know that's Old Testament, that's the other side of the cross. This is about the nation of Israel, not about us as Gentiles on this side of the cross. But it is still the same God that says, this is about me. Live your life about me. When you find difficulties in your path, and boy, how many on our prayer list here this week, when you're facing chaos, when you're facing confusion, when you're facing the storms, when you're facing, on our prayer list today, COVID. This is about me. No, not the disease. That's about sin. That's about death. That's about because of sin in Genesis. But it's about me. Keep your mind focused on me. Keep your mind and your life and your heart. And what does it say here? That you seek not after your own heart and your own eyes, after which you used to go whoring. But make this about me. See me. Remember me. Live for me. I am the Lord your God. And so we have a cue to remember. They had those little dangly things with the blue thread. The danger to remember. So you don't go like you once did, a whoring after what you're concluding. So you're not like following their steps of those 10 bad spies who went seeking and following after the imaginations of their heart, void of God. And the reason is I'm the Lord your God. It's about him. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you again for the reminder of the nation of Israel. We thank you for even the blue tassels. We thank you for the constant reminder of the rules, the restrictions that they had. We know that there was a reason for all those, the law. We know that there's a reason for even the first half of this chapter. As a school teacher, remind us of our sin to show us our need for you. For this is about you. And I pray that as we live out our lives, we live out lives that are for you, not following after our own eyes of what we can see and then interpret void of you, but that we live out our lives as a testimony to you, for you. For all things were created by you and for you. And I pray that we would truly rejoice in you and live out lives that glorify you, regardless of what the chaos is that we face, regardless of the struggles, regardless of the needs, regardless of the confusion and the times that our world seems upside down, that we'd always have our eyes fixed on you, putting you into the equation, and finding life and joy as a result. We thank you for it in Jesus' name. Amen.